Hello and welcome back to Unsavory History. My name is Valerie, and today we'll be discussing the history of whiteness. How the category we now think of as white was constructed, expanded, and transformed over time, and why many European groups that are considered unquestionably white today were not always viewed that way. Today, we're exploring a history that challenges many modern assumptions about race, identity, and belonging in America. Whiteness was invented, and it didn't always include everyone we call white today. When people talk about race today, many assume that white has always been a natural category, but history tells us a different story. The modern concept of whiteness was largely shaped by Western European and American social, political, and legal institutions, particularly during the colonial period and the centuries that followed. It wasn't simply about skin color, it was about power, status, and determining who belonged at the top of society. Today, Americans often think of Europeans as a single racial group, but throughout the 19th century, many people viewed Europeans as belonging to different races. Anglo Saxons and Nordics were often portrayed as superior, while Irish, Italian, Slavs, Jews, Greeks, and other groups were portrayed as biologically, culturally, and morally inferior. Scientific racism divided Europe into hierarchies. Writers and academics of the time claimed that Northern Europeans represented the highest form of civilization, while Southern and Eastern Europeans were prone to criminality, poverty, violence, or political radicalism. These ideas did not remain confined to academic journals. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the eugenics movement popularized the belief that humanity could be ranked into superior and inferior races. Many eugenicists placed Nordic and Anglo Saxon peoples at the top of these hierarchies while portraying Southern Europeans and Eastern Europeans, Druze, and other groups as politically deficient. These theories influenced immigration policy, public discourse, and racial ideologies throughout the Western world. The Irish were stereotyped as unintelligent, violent, and incapable of self government. Newspapers frequently compared them to apes. Catholics were viewed with suspicion and accused of having greater loyalty to Rome than to America. This hostility produced political movements dedicated to restricting immigrant influence. The Know Nothing movement rose to prominence in the 1850s by promoting anti immigrant and anti Catholic sentiment. Their goal was to protect what they considered real Americans from the growing influence of Irish and German immigrants. German immigrants also faced widespread discrimination. During World War I, anti-immigrant sentiment exploded across the country. German language newspapers disappeared, schools stopped teaching German, and communities were pressured to abandon traditions that had existed for generations. One often overlooked example is Prohibition. While the temperance movement had many motivations, including religious and moral concerns, it was also deeply connected to nativism and anti immigrant politics. Many of the saloons targeted by reformers were owned and frequented by Irish, German, Italian, and Eastern European immigrants. To many prohibition advocates, alcohol represented more than a public health issue. It represented immigrant culture itself. German beer gardens, Irish pubs, and Southern European drinking traditions were portrayed as threats to American civilization. Closing saloons became a way to police immigrant communities and force assimilation into an Anglo Protestant version of America. In this sense, prohibition was not simply a campaign against alcohol, it was also part of a broader effort to suppress cultures associated with immigrant populations that were still viewed as foreign and inferior. By the early 20th century, however, the story was already beginning to change. The same German and Irish communities whose culture had been targeted through anti immigration movements and prohibition campaigns were increasingly being absorbed into a broader category of whiteness. Customs once portrayed as foreign and threatening gradually became accepted as part of mainstream American life. The boundaries of belonging had begun to move. The Italians faced some of the most brutal treatment of any European immigrant group. In 1891, 11 Italian immigrants were lynched in New Orleans after being accused of involvement in a murder. It remains one of the largest mass lynchings in American history. The violence directed at Italians demonstrates an uncomfortable truth. There was a time when many Americans did not consider Italians fully part of the same racial community as Anglo Americans. Jewish immigrants and many Eastern Europeans encountered similar prejudices. Universities, neighborhoods, social clubs, and employers often imposed quotas and restrictions designed to limit their participation in American life. Although many of these groups were legally classified as white, they were often treated socially as separate and inferior races within a broader European hierarchy. At the same time, Black Americans faced an even harsher system of exclusion through segregation, disenfranchisement, racial terror, and economic exploitation. The existence of this racial hierarchy would eventually become central to the expansion of whiteness itself. As industrialization transformed America, millions of workers found themselves living in crowded neighborhoods, working dangerous jobs, and struggling under many of the same economic conditions. In some cases, Black workers and immigrant workers recognized common interests. Labor movements occasionally brought together people who shared economic grievances, despite ethnic and racial differences. For elites who benefited from existing social hierarchies, these potential alliances were concerning. According to many historians, one result of these social and political pressures was the gradual expansion of the boundaries of whiteness. Groups that had once been treated as separate and inferior races increasingly came to view themselves and were increasingly viewed by others as members of a broader white community. This broader identity offered social advantages, political inclusion, and economic opportunities that remained largely unavailable to Black Americans. The message was often subtle but powerful. Regardless of how Anglo Americans viewed you, your position could be secured by identifying with whiteness rather than with the marginalized groups. This process didn't happen overnight. The Irish provide one of the clearest examples. Upon arriving in large numbers during the 19th century, they faced discrimination, exclusion from jobs, and intense social hostility. Yet over time, many Irish Americans gained political power and increasingly became accepted as part of mainstream white America. The story was similar for Italians, Jews, Slavs, and many Eastern Europeans. Communities that had once been viewed as foreign races gradually became incorporated into a broader white identity. That incorporation often came with pressure. Sometimes that pressure manifested in moments when immigrant groups were forced to choose whether they would identify with other marginalized communities or seek acceptance with the existing racial order. Individuals and communities learned that acceptance frequently depended on distancing themselves from Black Americans and embracing the racial assumptions of that broader society. Not everyone accepted those assumptions, and many fought for labor rights, civil rights, and racial equality. But the incentives to conform were powerful. One tragic example occurred during the New York Draft Riots of 1863. Many of the rioters were Irish immigrants who feared economic competition and resented being drafted into the Civil War. The riots quickly became racial violence directed at Black residents. Although the Irish themselves had experienced discrimination, some sought acceptance by participating in the racial hierarchy rather than challenging it. Similar patterns appeared among other immigrant communities. As Italians, Jews, Slavs, and other European groups gained greater economic and political influence, many found that inclusion in mainstream American society often came with expectations about where they stood within the nation's racial hierarchy. The path to acceptance was rarely straightforward, but it frequently involved becoming identified less by ethnic origin and more by a shared white identity. This pattern would repeat throughout American history. By the mid 20th century, government policies helped accelerate the consolidation of whiteness. Programs associated with the New Deal and the post World War II era made home ownership and economic mobility more accessible for many European ethnic groups. Federal housing programs, mortgage guarantees, and suburban development helped millions of families build wealth. While these opportunities were extended broadly to people now considered white, Black Americans were often excluded through practices such as redlining and house discrimination. As a result, descendants of Irish, Italian, German, Jewish, Slavic, and other European immigrants increasingly came to share a common social position. Ethnic differences that had once seemed enormous began to fade beneath a broader white identity. At this point, an important question emerges. Was this process intentional? Historians agree that the boundaries of whiteness expanded over time, but they do not always agree on why or how it happened. Some scholars argue that political and economic elites consciously encouraged broader white identities in order to prevent solidarity among workers and preserve existing power structures. According to this view, expanding whiteness helped divide people who might otherwise have united around shared economic interests by granting certain privileges to European immigrant groups while continuing to exclude Black Americans. The racial hierarchy became more stable and more difficult to challenge. Other historians caution against viewing this process as a centrally planned conspiracy. They argue that no single group sat in a room and decided that Irish, Italians, Jews, Slavs, and other Europeans would become white. Instead, they emphasize a combination of forces: economic mobility, military service, political participation, suburbanization, intermarriage, declining immigration from Europe, and the gradual fading of old ethnic prejudices. In this interpretation, the expansion of whiteness was less a coordinated project and more of a cumulative result of countless decisions made by institutions, communities, employers, politicians, and ordinary individuals over generations. Yet, despite these disagreements, both perspectives arrive at a similar conclusion. The definition of who counted as white changed. Groups that had once been viewed as separate races, culturally inferior peoples, or permanent outsiders gradually became accepted as part of a broader white identity. Whether that transformation occurred through deliberate social engineering, through the incentives created by existing institutions, or through some combination of both remains a matter of debate. What is not debated is that the boundaries shifted, the category expanded. People who were once excluded were eventually brought inside. That reality challenges the idea that racial categories are fixed, timeless, or purely biological. Instead, it suggests that race is also shaped by history, politics, economics, and the changing needs of society itself. The irony is striking. Many Americans whose ancestors were once described as inferior, dangerous, foreign, or racially suspect now think of whiteness as a permanent and natural category. Yet history shows that the definition of whiteness changed repeatedly. The boundaries expanded when doing so strengthened existing systems of power. Groups that were once marginalized could be brought inside the circle, provided they accepted the hierarchy that the circle was designed to protect. Understanding this history does not diminish the suffering experienced by Irish, Italian, Jewish, German, Slavic, or other immigrant communities, nor does it suggest that their experiences were identical to those of Black Americans, Native Americans, or other racial minorities who faced different and often more severe forms of exclusion, and still do. Instead, it reveals how racial categories are constructed, reshaped, and expanded over time. Whiteness was never simply about skin color. It was a political and social category whose boundaries shifted according to the needs of the society that created it. The history of whiteness is therefore not just a story about exclusion. It is also a story about incorporation, about how groups once viewed as foreign, inferior, or even racially distinct were eventually brought inside the boundaries of belonging. The question is not whether those boundaries change. History clearly shows that they did. The more important question is why they changed, who they benefited when they changed, and what that tells us about the nature of race itself. If people once considered outsiders could become white, then whiteness was never simply a biological fact. It was a social category shaped by history, power, economics, and politics. A category whose boundaries have always been far more flexible than many Americans realize. Now, before we wrap up, I'd like to step away from the historical record for a moment and offer a personal observation. Throughout this history, we can see that whiteness was never just about ancestry or skin color. It was also tied to cultural expectations about what kinds of behavior was considered respectable, civilized, and worthy of acceptance. For centuries, many of the people who defined mainstream American culture inherited traditions that emphasized restraint, self discipline, emotional control, and public decorum. These values were heavily influenced by Protestant, Puritan, and later Victorian ideals. To be respectable was often to be reserved. Loudness, exuberance, emotional expression, and public displays of joy were frequently associated with disorder, lower status, and foreignness. What's interesting is that many of these same criticisms directed at Black Americans today were once directed at immigrant groups such as the Irish, Italians, and even Germans. They were often described as too loud, too emotional, too expressive, too prone to celebration, too attached to customs that did not fit Anglo American ideas of respectability. Over time, many of those groups were absorbed into mainstream whiteness. But the cultural standards themselves remained remarkably persistent. That raises an interesting question. When people react negatively to forms of expression they view as loud, boisterous, or excessive, are they responding only to race? Or are they also responding to centuries old cultural expectations about how respectable people are supposed to behave? I don't pretend to have a complete answer, but history suggests that ideas about race and ideas about respectability have often been intertwined. Understanding one may help us better understand the other. Now, on a personal level, I know these expectations affected me growing up. Like many people raised in predominantly white American culture, I was taught not to be too loud, not to take up too much space, not to draw attention to myself. If my laughter carried across the room, I was told to quiet down. If my excitement became too visible, I was reminded to be more reserved. The message wasn't always spoken directly, but it was there all the same. Don't be too much. Even today, I catch myself doing it. I have a distinct voice, but in public, I often make myself quieter. I try not to interrupt. I try not to be noticed. I shrink myself in ways I don't always realize because that restraint was taught to me as a virtue. And maybe that's why this history resonates with me. Because when I look at the groups we've discussed today, groups I share ancestry with, Irish immigrants, Italian immigrants, Germans, Jews, and others, I see people whose cultures were often criticized for being too expressive, too emotional, too loud, too visible. I see echoes of the same pressures that taught so many of us to make ourselves smaller. So I'd like to end with this. To my fellow Americans, embrace what makes you unique. And especially to Black Americans, whose culture, creativity, expression, joy, language, music, and voices have so often been criticized, misunderstood, or policed. Do not let anyone convince you that you need to become smaller to make others comfortable. Be unapologetically yourself. Be expressive, be joyful, be passionate, take up space. History shows us that many of the standards we inherit are not natural laws. They are social expectations created by people and institutions, and what was created can be questioned. You do not owe anyone your silence. And perhaps one of the most powerful ways to challenge old systems is simply refusing to hide who you are. Thank you so much for watching Unsavory History, and I hope you're leaving with more knowledge and understanding than you came here with. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to like, subscribe, and share. And as always, I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.